we're ready to begin. So my name's Veronica Reynolds. I'm the head of community relations here at New City Library, and usually you would see me because I am hosting the talk, but today I'm giving the talk. I do this once quarterly. I have done numerous authors as well as focused on specific Shakespeare plays. I did give this talk once before, but it was live and I had requests to give it as a Zoom talk as well, so I'm happy to be here with you today. To give you the Jane Austen life overview and some discussion of her works. And if you want, as we're going through, feel free to put questions into the chat. I will try and answer them as they come up. But if it is something that I want to go into a little more in depth, then I may wait until the very end, and I may unmute for questions at the end as well. We'll see how we're going with time. So I want to respect everybody's time here. All right. So who was Jane Austen? We're going to go through three major topics today, which I'm going to give you an overview of the Georgian era that Jane was a part of, some discussion on her life and her history, and then we're going to end talking about her work. So let's get started. So the Georgian era is often also called the Regency era, even though technically the Regency era is a small slice of the overall Georgian era. And Jane is very much a part of the Regency era, which would color romance novels for the rest of time. We do currently call many romance novels set in the Georgian era Regency novels, so she certainly set the tone. The Georgian era runs from 1714 to 1830 or 1837, depending if the historian is including the reign of William IV. It's called the Georgian era because it was chock full of Georges. Kings George I, II, III, and IV all reigned in that order. The Regency era is the sub-period that's defined by the reign of George IV. He was the Prince of Wales. During the illness of his father, George III. So he stepped up during that time, 1811 to 1820. He was a particularly kind of popular person who's definitely set a tone that would wind up defining the era. Regency, like I said, often just used in place of Georgian to define the same period. This comes up a lot in media, particularly, so you always have to ask yourself, is this Georgian or is this Regency? Does it matter? Generally, the style of dress and a lot of the things we're going to talk about shortly were consistent through the Georgian era, but Regency has a particular flavor. Certainly, if you watch Bridgerton or anything like that, they are intended to be set fairly solidly in the Regency era. England is at war for most of the Regency period. Napoleon is on the march, and England was one of his many targets. In 1815, Britain soundly defeats the French at Waterloo, a battle you may have heard of, which puts to rest the fears of invasion and confirms England at the time as a dominant European power. While the war is going on, it was very common to house the military in small towns, and you may have come across this if you've ever read a Jane Austen novel. The idea that the military are in your town would have brought a lot of young ladies out for interest because the military men did make an okay living. They had money coming in. Some of them were purchased officers, meaning that they had bought their way into the military. So certainly you had quite a few prominent potential mates there. Art and architecture. So the architecture of the Georgian era is heavily influenced by the style of Andrea Palladio and eventually arrives at this kind of neoclassical style. The homes of the wealthy were meant to have an understated elegance. I don't know if you'd call this understated, but it's a little bit less showy than what we think of for like Victorian era. And there was an emphasis on symmetry. Painters are also moving towards a neoclassical period with an emphasis on romanticism. So we see here, I don't know about you, but this painting was a big part of my childhood because my grandparents had a version of it hanging up in an oval frame. So Joshua Reynolds' Persist, this was called The Age of Innocence. That was the kind of thing that you were seeing. But simultaneously, you're also getting J.W. Turner, often called the father of Impressionism. So it's this interesting moment in art history as well, where we're moving from realism into Impressionism. The fashion. So I think often when we think of like Victorian era, huge ball gowns, big bustles, big sleeves. But when we're talking about the Georgian era, the dress is actually much simpler. Women are begin to wear what we call une chemise or chemise dress. Now, chemise now means something you wore under your dress or just as a nightgown. But at the time, it was meant to be like a freer flowing look. It's an advent of style associated with Marie Antoinette. You can see here Marie Antoinette in a robe de chemise. And because of its association with her, it's initially known as a chemise à la reine, or the Queen's chemise, where men's fashion becomes more and more stripped down through the Georgian era until we get something much more simplified. And if this looks complicated to you, remember we're talking about disappearance of neck ruffles, of very complicated jackets and layers. They're giving way. There's no more embellishment, possibly because of reactions to excess. They are now going to a more austere look, and this matches that slimming down of the female profile as well. And because getting dressed can be a complicated thing, just realized I am going to have to show my screen in a different way. One moment, so that you can all see this video. I found a really great video that is meant to be from Jane and her sister's perspective on getting dressed.
Jane Austen and her sister Cassandra shared many aspects of their lives, including a bedroom. In a letter, Jane wrote that she had made herself 2 or 3 caps which save a world of torment as to hairdressing, that she wore her hair plaited up out of sight, and that her fringe curled well enough to need no papering. Women who shared their living space also helped one another in dressing. Short-sleeved linen shifts were worn next to the skin, and corded cotton stays provided support.
So stays,
the stays could be waist length or shorter and usually laced closed at the back. Full-length linen or cotton petticoats were worn over the stays to smooth out their outline.
So, then they would have had the overdress, is what they're showing you. They would have tucked in strings, that kind of thing.
The front-fastening white gown is made from a cotton muslin with raised dots. It is an apron front or full front gown, which was another popular style in the early 1800s. The bodice has a crossover front which would be pinned or tied into place. The bib front is pulled up, much like an apron front, and pinned or buttoned into place.
Remember, we have no zippers yet in a lot of these dresses. Certainly no Velcro.
The apron has ties which run from the front, through handmade belt loops, and tie at the back. A tiny cushion bustle is hidden in the small of the back of the dress to lift the gathers of the skirt. Jane preferred to wear her handmade day caps to save time otherwise spent on hairdressing.
That's it. That is the look of the Georgian era, and that is how most of the Austen heroines would have been dressed as well. Other writers of the day, we have Percy Bysshe Shelley, also known as Mary Shelley's husband, Sir Walter Scott, Susan Ferrier, Maria Edgeworth, E.T.A. Hoffmann. They're all writing around this time. In poetry, we have Byron and Blake and Wordsworth and Keats. So it's a very prosperous era of the arts in England. Regency and Romanticism went hand in hand. Novels and poetry are full of scandalous love matches in a way, I think, for women and men at the time to live vicariously through these risque relationships. Because as we'll explore, and as Jane explores so beautifully, if you were of any kind of higher class, everything was very rigid. The idea of love matches themselves was not so prevalent yet. So often these kind of beautiful novels and poems with their grand love stories allowed people to experience those things by proxy. And you do get Mary Shelley writing horror for the first time. So let's talk about the Gentry. So this comes up so much in Jane's books that we can't not talk about it. At the top level, you can see we have our pie cake situation here, which I quite liked. This is a line illustration from the time, from the period. So at the top you have the aristocrats, and they can be finely sliced by importance. So the royal family, of course, is right on top. And then you have other landed gentry. And after them were people who were landowners, who might be known as nouveau riche. They have money from trade, but they're not yet owning land. The social goal, and it's mentioned a lot in Austen's books, is to become accepted as part of the ton. The word in this context is manners, means manners or style, and it's pronounced as in French. The full phrase is le bon ton, meaning etiquette, good manners, good form, characteristics that were held at the ideal by the British bon monde. Even though they were at war with France, they still liked using fancy French words to describe things. So at the start of the 19th century, the landed gentry were a very small part of the population. The peerage includes about 300 families, that's people with titles, and then the landed gentry is 540 baronets, 350 knights, 6,000 landed squires, and 20,000 gentlemen. This group is only 1.5% of the national population, and they possess about 16% of the national income. So this is our 1%ers that we might talk about now. And I would say if we were going by amount of novels written about dukes, they all have about 6 novels each written about them, at least. So let's talk about being a lady or a gentleman and education, for instance. A lady's education was limited to marriageable skills. We're not going to college at this period. You may, if you've read Pride and Prejudice, remember that Mr. Darcy has a list that he very arrogantly spins off and says that an accomplished lady must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, all the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air, her manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved. And Elizabeth, of course, quips to this that it's amazing to her that he knows anybody that fulfills those provenances. But it would not have been unusual for an upper class girl to be taking drawing lessons, dancing lessons. She would have been able to read, certainly, but that would have been so that she could read aloud and do other kind of entertainment type things. Remember, we have no radio, we have no television. This is how they're entertaining each other as well. Drawing sessions, book clubs, that kind of thing. Going for long walks. Only men could inherit wealth and land. Unless widowed, women did not have a hold of their own finances, and they were at the mercy of the men in their lives. And this is a huge trope in Jane Austen's books. So let's talk about Jane herself. Well, first we're going to talk about her family. Can't talk about somebody until you know their background, right? So her father, George Austen, is born in 1731. His mother died in childbirth, and his father died a year after marrying his new wife, and she did not want to take responsibility for a child. So he's a total orphan, very, very young. So he and his sisters are sent to live with an aunt. He earns a fellowship to study at St. John's. He's smart, he's ambitious, and he has some financial support from an uncle. So he manages to get a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Oxford. He goes to work as a rector, who's a member of the clergy that's in charge of the parish, Anglican parish, and he gets a parish in Steventon and Dean. It's not a very large parish. There's only 30 families, so he was not drawing very much money because those families would tithe into the parish. He was known to be attractive, so this is a quote from his niece, which interpret as you will. He said, "I have always understood that he was considered extremely handsome, and it was a beauty which stood by him all his life." This, by the way, is the man in question. I believe that is a line drawing. At the time when I have a perfect recollection of him, he must have been hard upon 70, but his hair was in milk whiteness, might have belonged to a much older man. It was beautiful, with short curls about the ears. His eyes were not large, but peculiar and bright hazel. My Aunt Jane's were something like them, but none of the children had precisely the same, excepting my Uncle Henry. This is Jane's mother. This is another drawing. She was born Cassandra Lee. She was from a higher social class than her husband. Her family was like a known name. People would have known the Lee family. And her brother did inherit a very large fortune. But of course, that does not go to Cassandra. They believe that George and her met while he was working at St. John's College in Oxford, and they seem to have gotten engaged in 1763 because they exchanged miniatures. So miniatures being a very small portrait of each other, which was likely the act only done by people who were very much in love. We don't know a lot about her except that she wasn't a very well woman. She was often sick. It's very easy to read mother-daughter relationships in Jane's work to look for her, but we honestly just don't know very much. I've told you almost everything that's known for certain about her. So their married lives together, this is them in silhouette. They are married on April 26, 1764, at Swinton's Church in Bath in a simple ceremony 2 months after Cassandra's father has died. Presumably, the match was approved of by her family. We don't have evidence that she ran away, but she is supposed to get a very small inheritance when her mother dies. Supposedly, by every source that we have, they had a happy marriage. He would augment the family income from the parish tithing by opening a boarding school at the rectory. So the sons of local gentlemen, who were probably not very high-ranking gentlemen, but they had enough money to make this worth George's while, would come to him to learn, and they also sold produce from the farm. So the entire time of Jane's youth, there's at least 4 or 5 boys unrelated to her living in the house, which would have given her a lot of time to study them. Jane's siblings, so you can see our sibling tree over there, their little family tree. Those are all as many drawings or photos as, well, none of them are photos, but as many drawings and as artistic renderings we have of this family. Jane had 7 siblings, 6 brothers and 1 sister, and her brother was, I love this, it's like a recitation of common British names: James, George, Edward, Henry Thomas, Francis William, also known as Frank, and Charles John. They were all older than Jane, except for Charles John, who's born in 1779. The oldest is James, born in 1765. Her one sister, who's a very important character to us, is named after their mother, Cassandra Elizabeth. She's only 2 years older than Jane. And not only did she have a huge impact on Jane in her life, she's also shaped what we know about Jane today, which I'll talk about a little later. James, the eldest son, was an accomplished writer and poet himself, and people called him the writer of the family. So you can imagine that must have been an interesting feeling for Jane at the age of 12. So this is a thing that happened pretty frequently. So, of course, George Austen himself had been fostered out. But at age 12, this may seem weird, they adopt Edward out to the Knight family, and his name is changed. This was done for his own benefit because he would now go on to inherit the estate because they had no sons. This gave the Austens some upward mobility and really the only way they could. But he leaves the family home. He goes to live with the Knights. He becomes one of them. One of his daughters would go on to become Jane's favorite niece. So he was still talking to the family, still relating to the family, but was separated out from them. It seems likely that George Austen Jr., the one born in 1766, was profoundly disabled, and he is also fostered out from the family. Again, sadly, not uncommon. Jane didn't even meet him until he was in his early teens. It's possible that she did not even know he existed until that point, because people would often hide away disabled family members, unfortunately. But Jane's favorite brother was Henry. He oversees the publication of 2 of her novels. He's a failed businessman, but he ultimately also becomes a minister. Francis and Charles both joined the Navy, and they both raised themselves up to the rank of admiral. So pretty accomplished family. The lady herself. So Jane is born in Steventon on December 16th, 1775. She was born late. Her father wrote of her arrival in a letter that her mother certainly expected to be brought to bed a month ago. Who knows how good they were at estimating these things at the time. The winter was really, really harsh, so she's not baptized until April 5th, and that is when she is given the single name of Jane. She does not have a middle name. This sketch becomes very important because it is the only representation that we have of Jane. It is the sole picture we have of Jane Austen, and it's a sketch by her sister Cassandra, And no one in her family thought it was a good likeness. So it's not even a good picture of Jane, but it's all we have. And you can see, just like they were talking about in the video, this is her cap that she liked to wear because she didn't want to do her hair. So Jane Austen's young life, obviously we're very interested in her education because of what she became. And she does almost get a professional education at age 7. She goes to Oxford with her sister to be educated by her aunt. To be educated by Mrs. Anne Cowley, who was like a professional raiser of young ladies. But they were both sent home in the autumn because they had typhus, and Jane almost dies. From then on, she's home educated. No one attempts to send her away to be educated again until she goes to boarding school and reading with her sister in 1785 at the Reading Abbey Girls' School. And the school curriculum probably included a lot of things we were talking about earlier. In addition, French, spelling, needlework. But again, dancing, music, maybe a little bit of drama. But again, they come home before December 1786 because they couldn't afford the schooling. So that is the beginning and the end of her professional schooling career. She's homeschooled for the rest of the time. She only ever lived with her immediate family after that as well. She never moves out of the family home. Private theatricals, which were very popular at the time, where you would put on scenes or even just a moment from a play with friends, were a big part of the education of all the Austens. They would stage these shows, large and small, in the rectory's barn. Through her brothers, Jane does get other views of the world. She does get to visit with them. And when you visited at this time, you didn't go for a long weekend. You were gone for weeks. So when she visited with Henry in London, she got to go to the theater, see art exhibitions. She went to social events. And because Edward had been adopted by the Knights, they kind of got a taste for a little bit of the privileged life of the landed gentry. Also, by all accounts, George Austen gave the girls free rein of his library, which was, as you remember, pretty vast because he's also a school teacher, so they were able to self-educate that way. So likely, despite never going really to school, Jane and Cassandra would have been very well-educated ladies for the time. And to show that education off, Jane starts writing really early. We would generally call writing in this area juvenilia, and Jane had a good amount of juvenilia. She started with the satire, and she wrote a book called The History of England, which was a parody of historical writing at the time, and her sister illustrates it for her. When she turns 18, she becomes an aunt for the first time, and she puts together a short story collection for the baby. Between the ages of 18 and 20, she works on a book called Lady Susan, which is an unfinished epistolatory novel, meaning it's about letters written back and forth. And a lot of people speculate that she based it on her brother's scandalous wives. Jane was not a huge fan of all of her brother's wives, and that might have been how she decided to deal with that. In 1796, Jane drafts Eleanor and Marianne, which was the first attempt at what would eventually become Sense and Sensibility. The early draft is lost, but the thinking is it was probably also an epistolatory. Not long after she wrote a book Not long after that, she writes a book called First Impressions, which would eventually become Pride and Prejudice. And it was a family favorite because she was reading all these stories out loud to entertain her family. That's really where they got their start. Her father did try to get it seen by a publisher. It did not succeed at the time. And then in 1798, she starts Susan, which would eventually become Northanger Abbey. So her first 4 books are already on the go in her early 20s. But in 1800, Jane's father decides to retire. He's going to get everybody out. Most of the boys are out of the house at this point. So it's just him, his wife, Jane, and her sister who are going to be moved to Bath. 50 miles from the only home Jane knew. Now remember, 50 miles is quite a venture when you just have a horse and a carriage. Some sources suggested Jane fainted upon hearing about the move. During her time in Bath, it didn't seem that Jane was writing, but we don't know that for a fact. We do know that she was heavily revising her previous work. People have speculated that maybe she was depressed with the move, or conversely, that maybe she had too much to do and she had tons of friends in Bath and she was busy. We don't know. Because her sister Cassandra burns many of her letters from this time, leaving a huge gap from 1801 to 1904. Why would she do that? It's pretty likely she was requested to. It was not unusual for people to request that their letters be burned after their death, but we don't know that for sure. So that whole period of Jane's life is unknown to us, quite the span to know very little about. So we do have, I wanted to give you a brief taste of Bath because it's an interesting place. So this is just a quick minute about where Jane would have been.
Let's start in the pump room, as that was where Catherine Morland was first introduced to Bath society, and where she came rushing back in the hopes of bumping into Mr. Let's start in the pump.
Come
on. Let's start in the pump room, as that was where Catherine Morland was first introduced to Bath society, and where she came rushing back in the hopes of bumping into Mr. Tilton. It's the centre of so much of the action in Northanger Abbey, where you can practically see Jane Austen parading up and down the road, observing people for inspiration for her cast of colourful characters. Right next door to the pump room are the Roman baths, which gave this city its name. While Jane Austen never actually wrote about the baths in any of her novels, it's possible that she might have taken a dip here, because the now closed baths were open to the public in Jane Austen's time. It's hard enough to imagine people being here 2 centuries ago, but it is unbelievable to imagine the Romans being here almost 2 millennia ago. But back to Jane Austen, we next went on a mission to track down all the places she lived in Bath. You'd think the whole city would be shouting it from the rooftops, but actually, of all the places around the city that Jane Austen lived, this is the only one that has a plaque showing off that she lived here. Apparently, this area was the red light district of Jane Austen's day, so it's a little bit awkward that that's where she, her mother and her sister ended up living for their final stay in Bath. In Jane's letters to Cassandra, she talks about walking around the Royal Crescent to get some fresh air. It's not hard to see why she chose these views. Now this is Great Pulteney Street, which back in Jane Austen's day was just called Pulteney Street, and you may recognise as the street where Catherine Morland stayed in Northanger Abbey. We are now here on Milsom Street, which in Jane Austen's time was the most fashionable shopping destination, and fans of Persuasion will recognise it because it's where Anne saw Captain Wentworth again in Bath for the first time. And Union Street is even more exciting because this is where Anne Elliot bumps into Captain Wentworth right at the novel's end, just in time for them to declare their love to each other. Sally Lunn's buns are so famous that even Jane Austen wrote to her sister about them. That's how good they're supposed to be. And I really wanted to try one, but I left my purse behind. And of course, I've been saving the best or last, the Jane Austen Centre, where you can learn all about Jane Austen's life and her family, and even try on some of the clothes.
So that's a very brief, quick little overview. I'm just checking the chat here. Okay. Very brief little overview of Jane's time in Bath. So she did live in several places, and yes, she did live in a pretty dusty neighborhood towards the end. But before we get there, Jane wrote about love. So people assume that she must have had a lot of love in her life. And again, we're not 100% sure about how serious any of these relationships got, but Jane doesn't marry. She is a woman who writes very deeply and long about the beauty of marriage and never marries herself. So I thought it would be prudent to talk about her suitors. The first one is this gentleman, Lefroy. He is probably the one that came closest to actually marrying her. In 1795, before the move to Bath, he's born in Ireland. He goes to Trinity College, where he's very successful. He's 19 when he meets Jane. They attend a lot of balls and parties at mutual friends' houses, and she writes about him to Cassandra in a letter that we actually still have, describing about how they danced together and that she enjoyed it. Now, according to the Jane Austen Society of North America, in one letter a year later, Austen does allude to a possible proposal from Lefroy that she intended to turn down because the match doesn't meet with any approval. Neither of them have any money, and he's dependent on a relative for his education. He moves back to Ireland, where he marries an heiress and becomes Lord Chief Justice of Ireland, serving from 1852 to 1866, hence this very smart line drawing of him. Some people said that maybe he was the inspiration for Mr. Darcy, but still others say that he's actually the inspiration for Elizabeth Bennet, because Jane models Darcy on herself. So imagine that. Now, when he does learn of Jane's death later on in his life, Lefroy goes all the way back to England to pay his respects. So clearly he still had some amount of affection for her. Once she turns down his proposal, Jane only has one opportunity to find out how he's doing. And she says in a letter that she is too proud to ask. And she only finds out that he went back to Ireland because luckily her father asks instead. So we can imagine that moment of pride that she doesn't want to admit, that she even wants to know if he's all right, but she kind of still secretly does. The next big suitor is Big Wither. I love that name, Big Wither. During her time in Steventon, the Austens lived next to the Big Wither family of Manydown. And after moving away, Jane and her sister returned to visit their friends and neighbors in the fall of 1802. Harris Bigwether is only 21 at the time, and he proposes to Jane, who is almost 27. This would have been a pretty big age gap at the time, especially with the woman being older. And he does so on the evening of December 2nd, 1802. Jane is conflicted because she has no income. She's relying on her brother at this point, so she accepts. And then she immediately reverses her decision overnight. She breaks off the engagement in the morning, and they leave town. Like, they get in a carriage and they disappear. She beats a track with her sister. They get out of there. Well, Cassandra's burning of the letters means we don't have a record of other potential love interests. What we do know is that she stayed friends with the Bigwither sisters. She kept going to visit them. So apparently, even though they had this big dramatic meltdown, she was friendly and beloved enough that they said, come back and visit us anyway. I don't know how their brother felt about that, but Jane was still a welcome guest in their house. Moved to Southampton. So they've been in Bath for a few years, 5 years, but on January 1st, 1805, George Austen falls ill and he is dead by January 21st. They have no money coming in, the Austen women. This is her mother, Cassandra, and Jane. They have to rely on their brothers to take care of them. Jane grieves very much for her father. She writes to one of her brothers, we've lost an excellent father. An illness of only 8 and 40 hours carried him off yesterday morning between 10 and 11. His tenderness of a father who can do justice to. Now, you may have noticed she says 48 hours, and I've told you that he gets sick on January 1st and he dies on January 21st. They thought he was getting better, and he got significantly worse. Next year, the ladies move from rented quarters in Bath to go back to this prolonged family visit in Southampton, and then once more into temporary quarters. So they're moving around. They don't know what they're going to be able to do with their lives. But at last, fostering Edward off to the Knights pays off, because in 1806, he's able to offer them permanent use of a cottage on his estate called Chowton House, which is in the village of Chowton. But life is way quieter in Chowton. It's the quietest things have been since they moved to Bath. The Austens don't socialize with the Gentry, and they only entertain when family visited. They don't have a man to introduce them to society. They don't really have much to recommend them. Both of the women are older than normal marriageable age. Things have just become very quiet. Jane's niece Anna describes the family life in Chowton as a very quiet life according to our ideas, but they were great readers, and besides the housekeeping, our aunts occupied themselves in working with the poor and in teaching some girl or boy to read or write. So they were teaching local children, and they were keeping their house, and they were reading. So it was a household of much busyness without menfolk. And they probably related, they become Jane's most productive years as a writer. Do you have a little tour of Chowton House? I don't believe this shows the tinier house for much of it, but this is the estate of Chowton.
Jane Austen always referred to the larger house as the Great House in her letters, and it was as familiar to her as her own home. One letter talks about going to the Great House, where she dawdled away an hour very comfortably. Other letters describe her dining at the Great House with her brothers and sisters. The house is now a visitor attraction with the Austen family heirlooms, as well as a collection of early women's writing. First editions of Jane's work and many other women's writers are kept in the library's collection. The house also features the Knight family dining table, at which Jane herself would have dined, alongside a portrait of her brother Edward, his handwritten travel journal, and a suit he owned as a young man. In the grounds is an Elizabeth Blackwell-inspired herb garden, commissioned by Edward and frequently mentioned by Jane in her letters.
This is the reading room that did belong to the Knight family, and would have housed their books, well, part of their collection here in this collection. And people can come here and view this room and have a look round and see what sort of books that we have here in the collection. And then we've got exhibition cabinets all round the building, so we can exhibit a lot of rare books for people to have a look at when they arrive.
Jane Austen's House Museum in Chawton is the house where Jane Austen lived for the last 8 years of her life, and is the most treasured Austen site in the world. The museum receives between 40 to 50,000 visitors a year, and houses an unrivaled collection of objects owned by Jane Austen and her family.
So yeah, that's a site that you can visit and find out more about if you so desire. So Jane starts feeling sick in early 1816, and she ignores the warning signs. In fairness to her, there's not much they probably could have done for her, but by the middle of that year, her decline is unmistakable, and she begins this slow, kind of irregular deterioration. We don't know what ultimately caused her illness, but people speculate Addison's disease or Hodgkin's lymphoma. When her uncle dies, he leaves his entire fortune to his wife, disinheriting all of his relatives. Remember, this is money that these women could have sorely used. Jane suffers a major relapse and writes, "I am ashamed to say that the shock of my uncle's will brought on a relapse, but a weak body must excuse weak nerves." Frequently in Jane's books, she mocks people who she perceives to be hypochondriacs, and so she pushes through her illness. She's not going to be one of these people who's downed by illness. She keeps writing, editing, and adding chapters to Sensibility, which is what she's working on at the time. As her illness progresses, she experienced difficulty walking, she lacked energy, and by mid-April, she is confined to bed. And she dies on July 18th, 1817, and she is only 41 years old. Henry, who we may remember is her favorite brother, uses his clerical connections and arranges for his sister to be buried in the north aisle, the nave of Winchester Cathedral. The epitaph is composed by her brother James. Remember, he's the writer of the family. And he praises Austen's personal qualities, expresses hope for her salvation, mentions the extraordinary endowments of her mind. He does not mention that she wrote books. So her grave does not mention that she's an author. So we're going to talk about the fact that she was an author. Let's talk about some Jane Austen work. So you may remember I talked about Lady Susan way back at the beginning, and aided by her father, they did actually manage to get Lady Susan sold to a publisher, but he was not required to do anything with the manuscript, and he didn't. So in 1809, Jane buys the manuscript back from him, though she would have to wait a couple more years to reclaim the copyright. She couldn't afford it at the time. She had to rewrite the book, and it's not published until way after her death in 1871. Unlike her other books, Lady Susan is not a good lady. She's not a good person. She's an unscrupulous schemer in a relationship with a married man. So it's very different from her other books, but it was the first one that she wrote. Sense and Sensibility, which is the first of the really famous ones, is published anonymously. Several of her books are published anonymously. All female authors were forced to publish anonymously. So Sense and Sensibility comes out in 1811, and it's credited to a lady. The novel reflects Jane's life. Eleanor and Marianne, who are very close sisters, are forced by circumstances to rent a small cottage on a relative's land along with their mother, and they don't have many marriage prospects. Jane's brother Henry becomes a middleman to work with her publisher, Thomas Egerton, and he agrees to publish Sense and Sensibility, which, like all of Jane's novels, are published on what's called commission, meaning that all of the financial risk is on the author. The publisher is just a median. He gets it out there, but if it doesn't sell, then the author has put their money into publishing it for no reason. Now, the reviews come in, and it's favorable. People like Sense and Sensibility, and the novel becomes very fashionable, and the edition sells out by mid-1813. Austen's novels were published in larger editions than were normal for this period because there's not a lot of people reading novels yet. There's not with literacy rates, with having the free time and the ability to buy books, you weren't often doing large runs. So most novels were published in editions of 500 or less to reduce risk. But her novels wound up going into second and third runs because they were so popular. So I could describe to you the wit of Jane Austen, but I thought this talk did it a little bit better, so I'm going to let you watch The Wicked Wit of Jane Austen.
Whether she's describing bickering families, quiet declarations of love, or juicy gossip, Jane Austen's writing often feels as though it was written just for you. Her dry wit and cheeky playfulness informs her heroines, whose conversational tone welcomes readers with a conspiratorial wink. It's even been said that some readers feel like the author's secret confidant, trading letters with their delightfully wicked friend Jane. But this unique brand of tongue-in-cheek humour is just one of the many feats found in her sly satires of society, civility, and sweeping romance. Written in the early 19th century, Austen's novels decode the sheltered lives of the upper classes in rural England. From resentment couched in pleasantries, to arguing that mass attraction, her work explores the bewildering collision of emotions and etiquette. But while romance is a common thread in her work, Austen dismissed the sentimental style of writing so popular at the time. Instead of lofty love stories, her characters act naturally, and often awkwardly. They trade pragmatic advice, friendly jokes, and not-so-friendly barbs about their arrogant peers. As they grapple with the endless rules of their society, Austen's characters can usually find humour in all the hypocrisy, propriety, and small talk. As Mr. Bennet jokes to his favourite daughter, "For what do we live but to make sport for our neighbours and laugh at them in our turn?" And though her heroines might ridicule senseless social mores, Austen fully understood the practical importance of maintaining appearances. At the time she was writing, a wealthy marriage was a financial necessity for most young women, and she often explores the tension between the mythical quest for love and the economic benefits of making a match. The savvy socialite Mary Crawford sums this up in Mansfield Park. "I would have everybody marry if they can do it properly. I do not like to have people throw themselves away." Unsurprisingly, these themes were also present in Austen's personal life. Born in 1775, she lived in the social circles found in her novels. Jane's parents supported her education and provided a space for her to write and publish her work anonymously. But writing was hardly lucrative work, and although she had sparks of chemistry, she never married. Elements of her circumstances can be found in many of her characters, often intelligent women with witty, pragmatic personalities and rich inner lives. These headstrong heroines provide an entertaining anchor for their tumultuous romantic narratives. Like the irreverent Elizabeth Bennet of Pride and Prejudice, whose devotion to her sisters' love lives blinds her to a clumsy suitor. Or the iron-willed Anne Elliot of Persuasion, who chooses to remain unmarried after the disappearance of her first love. And Eleanor Dashwood, who fiercely protects her family at the cost of her own desires in Sense and Sensibility. These women all encounter difficult choices about romantic, filial, and financial stability, and they resolve them without sacrificing their values or their sense of humour. Of course, these characters are far from perfect. They often think they have all the answers, and by telling the story from their perspective, Austen tricks the viewer into believing their heroine knows best, only to pull the rug out from under the protagonist and the reader. In Emma, the titular character feels surrounded by dull neighbours and friends who can't hope to match her wit. As her guests prattle on and on about nothing, the reader begins to agree. Emma is the only exciting character in this quiet neighbourhood. Yet despite her swelling ego, Emma may not be as in control as she thinks, in life or love. And Austen's intimate use of perspective makes these revelations doubly surprising, blindsiding both Emma and her audience. But rather than diminishing her host of heroines, these flaws only confirm the inconsistency of all human characters. Their complexity has kept Austen prominent on stage and screen, and made her work easily adaptable for modern sensibilities. So hopefully, new readers will continue to find a friend in Miss Austen for many years to come.
And I think people do. I think Jane has left quite an impression. So let's talk about the big one. I would argue the biggest one as far as adaptations go. We get Pride and Prejudice. Jane starts writing this in Goodnestone Park in Kent with her brother Edward and his wife in 1796. She's staying there. It was originally titled First Impressions. Like I said, it was read aloud. The family loved it. So in 1797, her father sends the manuscript to a London bookseller, hoping that they'll consider it for publication, but it's declined. Around this time, the militia is mobilized after France declares war on Britain in February 1793. The Brighton camp, for which the militia regiment leaves in May, after spending the winter in Meryton, was opened in August 1793, and the barracks for all the regiments of the militia are completed by 1796. So most of the events of this novel are taking place between 1793 and 1795. Austen makes huge revisions to this manuscript between 1811 and 1812. The publisher that had purchased Sense and Sensibility buys it. It's the only book that she doesn't have to do by commission. It's published in 1813, and he pays her £110, which is the equivalent of about $9,000 today to Jane. And when you know how many copies that book has sold, you know that he had a real steal. So one of the beautiful things about Pride and Prejudice, about all of Jane's books, is the romance. So I thought, just to give that a quick honor, I do have a little clip from the 2005 movie, which is my personal favorite adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And I think you can see how enduring the romance is and how well it translates to film. So it's just a short clip of the end of Pride and Prejudice.
I couldn't sleep.
Laura, my aunt.
Yes, she was here.
How can I ever make amends for such behaviour?
After what you have done for Lydia, and I suspect for Jane also, it is I who should be making amends.
You must know. Surely you must know it was all for you. You are too generous to trifle with me. I believe you spoke with my aunt last night, and it has taught me to hope, as I had scarcely allowed myself before. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes have not changed, but one word from you will silence me forever. If, however, your feelings have changed, I would have to tell you. You have bewitched me, body and soul, and I love you, and never wish to be parted from you from this day on.
Well then. Your hands are cold.
Now, in Jane's time, that would be quite improper to be meeting outside alone, but they are sent for a long walk, and that is where they do fall in love for the final step of their affair. Mansfield Park. Published in 1814 with a new edition in 1816, Mansfield Park touches on similar themes to some of the previous works in her books, but there were no reviews of the book until 1821. The Gentry ignored it. A lot of her books would not be picked up by regular reviewers because it was by a woman. it still sold out within 6 months because a lady, had become quite the popular author. Mansfield Park is one of the books that's gone from lows to highs. People sometimes think it's the weakest of her novels. Sometimes people think it's the best. Some people think the heroine is boring. Some think that it's a combination of expectations. If you have feelings about Mansfield Park, let me know in the chat. And we mentioned Emma earlier. It's published in 1815, but often given the publication date of 1816. Emma's title character is described by Jane herself as, I am going to take a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. So Jane was sick about writing about proper women. She wanted to write about somebody who had a little bit of a selfish point of view. It was written after she moves to Chowton. It's the last novel to be published while she was still alive. And Sir Walter Scott himself anonymously reviewed the book, again anonymously, in 1816, and wrote, the author's knowledge of the world and the peculiar tact with which she presents characters that the reader cannot fail to recognize reminds us something of the merits of the Flemish school of painting. The subjects are not often elegant and certainly never grand, but they are finished up to nature and with a precision which delights the reader. Can't ask for a better review than that. Northanger Abbey is completed in 1803. It would not be published until 1817, so it's the first of the novels published after Jane's death. The novel follows a more Gothic style. It is not such a comedy of manners. It also satirizes Gothic novels a little bit by making the protagonist's obsession with those novels themselves color the perception of the world around her. And this is the hard-won back Lady Susan. It finally appears after her death. It's finished, and it finally makes its appearance. In the notes, Henry Austen finally acknowledges his sister as the author of all her previous works for the first time. So Jane is gone, but she finally is credited with her books, thanks to her favorite brother. Persuasion is the last of the completed novels. That comes out in 1817, although again, the title page reads 1818. Anne Elliot is the heroine, and she's notable because she's older. She's 27 years old, which is the same age that Jane was when Biggs Wither proposed to her. Because it's her last completed work, it's generally accepted as her most maturely written novel and shows her refinement of literary conception. Again, this is another heroine that was likely inspired by her brother's wives, but one that she liked, Fanny Austen, who was Charles' wife. Jane admired her for unfussiness and gallant good sense. So Fanny Austen, after the outbreak of 1812, the War of 1812, wanted to follow her husband back to North America, even though it was dangerous. And Jane was really impressed by this devotion and thought that Fanny's desire to be with her husband, no matter what, was very attractive. The book's title was her brother Henry's invention, because there was no evidence of what Jane might have titled it had she lived. In the 1820s, the books are out of print, but they're still being widely read in household libraries. And in 1832, Richard Bentley purchases the remaining copyrights to all of her novels. And over the following winter, he publishes 5 illustrated volumes as part of his standard novel series. So he was republishing a lot of works from the time. It's thanks to Bentley that we still have good, solid copies of these books to work with, because stuff in private libraries is more susceptible to disappearing over time. And in 1833, he releases the first collected edition of her work. And since then, Austen's novels have been continuously in print. Almost 200 years of being continuously in print. So needless to say, she has a huge legacy. Her critique of the sentimental novels of the second half of the 18th century are a big part of the transition to 19th century literary realism. Just as the art was changing from realism to impressionism, you have literature changing from romanticism to realism. And Jane is a big part of that movement. The take on romance in this period also had a huge influence on modern romances. So at the beginning, I was talking about that subgenre of Regency romance. You cannot go 5 feet without finding these in airport bookstores, in regular bookstores, and certainly in our library. Regency romances are incredibly popular. If you've ever seen the cover of a romance novel and the woman is wearing a decadent dress, 9 times out of 10 it's set in the Regency era and usually has a title like The Duke's Lady. But Jane was the reason for that. Her novels are fundamental to the romance genre, even though I would argue that her books are not very romance novel-like by modern standards. But there's dozens of adaptations and spin-offs, from straightforward BBC miniseries to tongue-in-cheek 90s comedies, like 10 Things I Hate About You, one of my favorite, not 10 Things I Hate About You, Clueless, which is an adaptation of Emma, if you've ever seen Clueless. So her work lives on, and it's a testament to her timeless wit that we can still find pleasure in her books.